The last good economic news today, today's inflation figures lower than predicted. Inflation fell from 6.8% last month on an annual basis to 5.6% now. Still high, but better. That said, food inflation was much higher than that, as you've probably seen in the shops, nearly 8%. Housing's still very high too, 8.4%. Now, what dragged down the average inflation rate was a big drop in petrol prices. But add to all that, Treasurer Jim Chalmers today was boasting the surplus he announced in the last budget will in fact be bigger than predicted.
Surplus will be substantially bigger than the $4.2 billion that we printed in May. We deliberately took a very cautious, very conservative, very responsible, very restrained approach to the surplus that we printed in May. We've banked almost all of the upward revisions to revenue. We found $40 billion in savings and reprioritisations, and we've shown spending restraint.
Joining me is the panel, Michael Costa, former New South Wales... Oh, sorry about that. I'd better shout the crew, slab a beer, that's tradition. Joining me is the panel, Michael Costa, former New South Wales Labor Treasurer, and David Gazzard, former Senior Advisor to Liberal Treasurer Peter Costello, now Head of DPG Advisory Solutions. Michael Costa, is Jim Chalmers right to take credit for the extra surplus?
I don't think he's right to take credit for the extra surplus, Andrew, but it is good to see an extra surplus. We certainly need it, given all the spending that's occurred in the past. What I find extraordinary about politicians, and it's of both persuasions, a year ago, the inflation was all due to energy prices in Europe, primarily because of the Ukrainian war. Now, when these very energy prices come down, rather than crediting them as being the basis of the lower inflation figures, we look at budget surpluses. Look, it's all nonsense. 1 month's figures, are really not an indicator of where inflation's going. It's good to see that they're lower, but the underlying inflation is still high. And the thing that worries me about Jim Chalmers' comments today is, you've got Bill Shorten claiming that the NDIS figure that they, loudly announced as a key indicator of their commitment to budget prudence is no longer a figure that they're going to seek to achieve. It's merely a target. Now, those numbers are baked into the budget. That was a 14% growth rate in the NDIS. There was a big hullabaloo about how they were going to get it down to 8%, and today he's walking away from it. That is more important than any of the comments that he's making today. So, look, take it all with a grain of salt.
Well picked up.
I still think interest rates are going to go up.
But David Gazzard, on the face of it, happier days again, inflation falling, a bigger surplus coming. How do you think that's going to go across with the voters, which is what Labor's hoping to appeal to?
Well, it's always better to have a bigger surplus, there's no doubt about that, and it's always better to have inflation falling. The key is whether it's sustainable. Michael is right, and if there's one thing that Jim Chalmers has done, he's learnt from the mistakes of Wayne Swan as Treasurer, because he was his Chief of Staff, and Swan tried to estimate where commodity prices would be and put that into a budget to demonstrate that he would hit a surplus. Instead of doing the tried and tested method of having a long, low average of commodity prices. So if commodity prices come in higher, you get a rabbit pulled out of the hat. And that's what's happened today. So as long as commodity prices stay high, the budget generally fares well. If commodity prices fall because the world goes back into recession or growth slows, then you're going to see that surplus evaporate fairly quickly. But, on the surface, it's a good thing to have. The thing I would say with inflation is that there's a measure that is the core measure of inflation, which is still stubbornly high. And I think that's what the Reserve Bank will be looking at when they set rates, and that could be difficult.
I think you're both right. We've got to wait a little while to see. Good, but let's not bank anything yet.